Welcome to the deep dive. Today we are diving into something that you've all been curious about.
Yeah.
Should the U.S. formally recognize Somaliland? We've got articles, reports,
Yeah.
even statements from Somaliland's leaders themselves.
Fascinating stuff.
It's going to be a fascinating deep dive.
Yeah, it really touches on some themes of self-determination,
Right.
strategic alliances, what success actually looks like in a really complex region.
Right. And I'll admit, I knew Somaliland existed, but mostly as like part of Somalia, on the Horn of Africa, that peninsula jutting out.
Right.
But these materials paint a very, very different picture.
Yeah, that's where it gets interesting because for over 30 years since 1991, Somaliland has been operating independently of Somalia.
Okay.
And not just a different government, but like a whole different reality.
Right. One article called Somalia like the textbook definition of a failed state,
Right.
with groups like Al-Shabaab often having more control than the government itself.
Which makes Somali stability even more striking.
Yeah.
So while Somalia is struggling, Somaliland has a functioning democracy, their own currency,
Wow.
a market-based economy. They've even had peaceful transfers of power, which is almost unheard of in that region.
Right. And that's before we even get to the arguments for the U.S. getting involved.
Yeah.
I mean, the moral argument is pretty compelling. Like Somaliland's asserted its independence for decades. They've got a distinct culture and history.
Right.
It's almost like denying them recognition is denying them their chosen path.
Yeah.
It's
this fascinating ethical dilemma. U.S. policy is essentially based on a fiction.
Right.
That Somaliland is simply part of Somalia, while on the ground it's a completely different story.
Right. And Somaliland's foreign minister put it really strongly. Somaliland is a sovereign country again.
Wow.
We were born free and we will stay free. There's this real sense of self-reliance in everything they're doing.
And that ties into the strategic arguments.
Yeah.
Remember Somaliland's location on the Gulf of Aden? That's a major shipping route.
Yeah.
Their port of Berbera is a key asset, and that's where the geopolitics comes in.
Oh, yeah, because suddenly everyone wants to be Somaliland's best friend.
Right.
We're talking about a potential U.S. ally right on China's doorstep.
The China factor is undeniable. They're pouring resources into Africa, expanding their influence. But Somaliland has been very clear they want partnerships, not puppet masters.
Okay.
There's a quote from a Somaliland official that stuck with me. China cannot dictate who Somaliland can have relations with.
That's a bold statement, especially given how much some nations rely on Chinese investment. But there seems to be a genuine belief in Somaliland that they can chart their own course.
Which brings us to the pragmatic argument for recognition.
Okay.
Somaliland is already functioning as an independent state. They have their own government laws, institutions. It's not a theoretical what if. It's happening right now.
So recognizing them isn't creating something new. It's acknowledging what already exists.
Exactly.
I'm starting to see why this is such a hot topic in foreign policy circles.
It raises a really intriguing question.
Yeah.
What would formal U.S. recognition actually achieve? What are the tangible benefits for both sides?
Right.
We need to go beyond just acknowledging reality and look at the practical implications.
Right, because it's not just about saying, okay, you're a country now.
Right.
There are potential consequences for the region, for Somalia, even for the U.S.'s relationship with China.
Absolutely.
Right.
There are definitely potential risks, but also potential rewards. Somaliland is clearly pitching itself as a reliable, democratic partner in a region where those qualities are rare.
President Muse Bihi Abdi was very clear about that. We share the same values, but you didn't know that. We are going to explain what Somaliland, a country at the Horn of Africa, no pirates, no terrorists in our country, free elections, free media, free market booming, and vibrant free market.
There's a lot packed into that statement.
Yeah.
It's a direct appeal to the U.S. emphasizing shared values and the potential for a mutually beneficial partnership.
Right. And it hints at something that really struck me as I was going through these materials. Somaliland's success seems to stem, in part, from a unique approach to peace and reconciliation.
Absolutely. After their war with Somalia, Somaliland engaged in a very different kind of nation building.
Okay.
Instead of top-down government, they focused on a bottom-up indigenous reconciliation process.
So I read that they involved clan elders, religious leaders, all sorts of community figures to really build peace from within.
Right.
It wasn't imposed from above. It was something that they created together.
And that's often cited as a major reason for their stability.
Okay.
It's a remarkable contrast to Somalia's struggles with clan warfare and factionalism.
Yeah, it's like they cracked the code of building a cohesive society in a place where everyone said it was impossible.
And that's what makes their story so compelling. They're not just surviving, they're thriving against all odds. But the big question remains, will the U.S. see them as a valuable enough partner to risk upsetting the status quo?
It's like a high-stakes poker game.
It is.
Both sides have a lot to gain, but the stakes are high, and the wrong move could have major consequences.
Yeah.
Speaking of stakes, what about the possibility of Somaliland actually hosting U.S. military bases?
Oh.
That was mentioned in one of the articles.
That's where the strategic implications get really interesting. Somaliland's foreign minister, Essa Cade, has suggested that they'd be open to hosting U.S. bases if it's mutually beneficial. Imagine the geopolitical shift.
A U.S. military presence in Somaliland would definitely send a message to China. It'd be a major power play in the region. But before we get too far ahead of ourselves, let's take a closer look at the potential challenges to recognition.
Right, because it's not just about what Somaliland and the U.S. want. There are other players in this game.
Right.
And they might not be so happy about this budding partnership.
Starting with Somalia itself, they've been pretty vocal in their opposition to Somaliland's independence, haven't they?
Absolutely. The Somali federal government sees this as a threat to their sovereignty. They've been actively lobbying against any moves toward recognition, arguing that it could further destabilize the region and set a dangerous precedent.
Right, and that fear of setting a precedent is something a lot of experts have brought up. If Somaliland gets recognized, what's to stop other regions with separatist movements from demanding the same thing?
Right.
It could create a domino effect.
That's one of the big concerns, not just in the Horn of Africa, but globally. The U.S. has to walk a tightrope here, balancing their support for Somaliland with the potential for wider instability.
It's like a geopolitical puzzle. You make one move, and it sets off a chain reaction.
It does.
But some experts argue that recognizing Somaliland could actually be a good thing for Somalia in the long run.
That's right. There's this idea that the current approach of propping up a failing Somali government isn't working.
Yeah.
Maybe recognizing Somaliland would force Somalia to confront its own problems and actually start making progress.
It's like a wake-up call. Like, hey, if you don't get your act together, your neighbors are going to leave you in the dust.
Exactly. It's a tough love approach, but some argue it's the only way to break the cycle of dysfunction. But it's definitely a risky gamble.
So lots of potential benefits, lots of potential risks, and a whole lot of uncertainty. What's the mood like in Washington right now? Is there any real appetite for recognizing Somaliland?
There are definitely signs of growing interest.
Okay.
It's not just a fringe idea anymore. There's bipartisan support in Congress for stronger ties with Somaliland.
I mean, there are actual bills and amendments being proposed, right? Like H.R. 10402, which calls for increased engagement with Somaliland.
Yeah.
And Senator Rish's amendment to the National Defense Authorization Act, which emphasizes Somaliland's strategic importance.
Yeah.
And then there's the Heritage Foundation's Project 2025, which includes recognizing Somaliland as a key foreign policy goal.
It seems like the momentum is building.
It is, and that's pretty significant, but it's still early days.
Okay.
There's a lot of resistance within the State Department.
And a lot of concerns that need to be addressed.
Bureaucracy moves slowly, as they say. But the fact that this is even being seriously considered is a big step for Somaliland. We've laid out the information, the contrasting viewpoints, the potential consequences. Now it's up to each listener to decide what they would do.
Exactly. Imagine you're sitting in the Oval Office. You've got this stack of intelligence reports, these impassioned pleas from Somaliland, the warnings from your advisors. What's your gut instinct?
Do you play it safe? Or do you take a chance on a nation that just might be the future of the Horn of Africa?
The choice is yours.
That's a wrap on this deep dive. But I have a feeling this is just the beginning of the story. Somaliland is a nation to watch no matter what happens next. Thanks for diving deep with us.